Hello and welcome to the Paris Peace Forum 2023. I'm very proud with Brute to host this spotlight with Jacinda Ardern. Welcome, Jacinda, to the Paris Peace Forum. We're here for like 20 minutes to discuss the Christchurch Call that held in 2019, the 15th of May. It was only 2 months after the horrific terrorist attack of Christchurch. There were 50 person killed, 51 person wounded. This terrorist attacked two different mosques in Christchurch. How do you recall that moment, Jacinda?
Well, firstly, bonjour and kia ora. Thank you for joining us for the session today. I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit of a conversation. There's a suggestion, and if there's a bit of time, we might freewheel a little bit and open up to the floor. But thank you for the question, because I think it really is important to give a bit of context to why we were motivated to create the Christchurch Call to Action in the first place. As you've described, on the 15th of March 2019, New Zealand's history really changed. The way we see ourselves changed, because on that day we had someone who was not from New Zealand, a citizen of another nation, had come into New Zealand with a very specific view that he believed New Zealand to be a place of multiculturalism, diversity and inclusion, and he wanted to disrupt that. He wrote a lengthy manifesto, which he released. He sent to multiple media outlets and politicians, including my office, and then within minutes later, he began a live stream as he entered into what was two mosques on that day and opened fire using legally obtained military semi-automatic weapons. You're right, he took the lives of 51 people that day, and the live stream was a particular feature of that attack. Now, we've seen social media used in the past, but just not to this extent. He was able to live stream the attack on Facebook for a full 17 minutes before it was removed. But I think one of the things that really sent reverberations around New Zealand, but indeed the world, was just then the proliferation of that content after it was filmed. So his intent was to try and create retaliation, to try and cause others to feel radicalized by what they saw, and to try and create division and hatred between people. In those early days, you saw at least his intention to weaponize the internet being relatively successful if your measure was the pure spread. In the first 24 hours, we saw the content uploaded to YouTube once per second, roughly, for the first 24 hours. In the weekend that followed, March 15, we saw Facebook alone took down 1.5 million copies of the video. And it wasn't always being spread with ill intent. You know, some people were linking to it simply out of the shock that it was there. In some cases, mainstream media were linking to it as part of their news stories. Just to give you a sense of how prolific it was, I remember in the hours after the attack, I was in a relatively small town in New Zealand when the attack occurred, and I was trying to make my way back to the capital in order to be briefed. And I wanted to make sure people knew that I would be doing a press conference and I would be sharing every piece of information we had, because rightly people felt afraid. I always managed my own social media, so I picked up my phone to open up Instagram in order to write a post, and the attack auto-played on my feed. And I remember I'd been told that he had live streamed it, so it was in my head that this had happened, but I don't think I'd quite clocked the extent of it. And I remember as I saw a few seconds, it took my brain a minute to realise what I was seeing, and just it was so horrific that I remember just involuntarily almost just throwing my phone so that I could try and unsee what was before me. I'm at Harvard at the moment, and I was having a short lecture in a class where at the end one of the students put his hand up and he said, March 15, where I was in the world, happened to also be my birthday. And he said, I saw the attack online. He said, I saw people dying, and he said, I've never been able to reconcile that I was celebrating another year of my life as I was watching other people's lives being taken away. And he said he would never forget seeing that. So this was the motivation for us. After March 15, there was an immediate move in New Zealand to really try and, amongst all the grief, to try and do something with the grief to try and prevent others having that experience. And initially, big focus on military-style weapons. We'd never seen them deployed like that in New Zealand before. No one believed there was any good cause to have those legally available. So in the first 10 days of the attack, we banned them. We banned all military-style semi-automatic weapons. And then people's minds turned to what had happened online. And there were a lot of questions over, how are you going to engage with social media companies? Have you met with Mark Zuckerberg? Are they going to come out and see you? There was just these questions daily. And I remember, of course, Facebook and other online providers did contact us because no one wanted to see this kind of content on their platforms. But I remember feeling like we had a very brief moment in time where we could ask something of companies. Now, small countries like New Zealand don't often have those opportunities, and we didn't want to let that go to waste, nor did we believe we could do anything on our own. So I remember very distinctly, it was around the time that Emmanuel Macron and France were working on these same issues, and so just to demystify the way that leaders work, I gave him a call. There was probably a little bit of scheduling that went on, but I gave him a call. I remember it was right before I was preparing to go to the memorial for March 15. And together we agreed that we would try and design something like the Christchurch Call. So 8 weeks later, we had 25 commitments, not just for tech companies, but for government and civil society. And that was the foundation of what we're now working on today.
At the moment, many observers described you as a model of leadership. How did you work on that at the moment?
So the Christchurch Call itself is a model of leadership within this environment. I would agree. Not in the sense that it's perfect, but in the sense that there's a lot of calls for a multi-stakeholder approaches to the issues that we face today, particularly in the tech space. And I think one of the reasons for that is because there's good recognition that so many of the issues, if you take AI as an example, so many of the issues that we're facing here are rapidly evolving. And sometimes these singular approaches or the levers that government often have are not always fit for purpose for all of the variations on the issues that we face. There is absolutely a role for regulation, but sometimes we need more than that as well. So if I had to look at our experience, it could have been easy, for instance, if we were just looking at a regulatory approach to come out and say we need to deal with the way that live streaming works, because ours was an issue very specific to live streaming. But actually that would have then been relevant for maybe 12 months, but it would not have ultimately got to the core of some of the issues we wanted to address, which is what are the causes for radicalisation in the first place and how does the online environment contribute to it? It wouldn't, for instance, then have given us a space to work on emerging issues like the role of new technologies and AI to radicalisation or violent extremist content. So a multi-stakeholder approach gives you a bit of flexibility on your agenda and tools. It means that we're not just looking at regulation, we're looking at the way that we work together to use all of the options, including the technology companies helping us understand what is the likely, what are the future pathways here? What does the future landscape look like? Because when you're a regulator, often quite hard to get some of those insights.
France and New Zealand are jointly governing the 5th Christchurch Call Summit in Paris. What's new this time?
So I can certainly tell you what exists now that didn't exist on March 15. Now, one of the things I really distinctly remember was that in our office, we're a country of 5 million people. We have a relatively intimate office for the Prime Minister. And I remember walking into our media team, 4 people. And some of them were on the phone trying to get through to social media companies to report where we were seeing large numbers of this video still present. And that was being done with individual companies. There was no coordinating system, or at least no effective coordination system to remove content of this nature. There was no crisis protocol that was readily deployable. So that was one of the things we looked to establish after Christchurch. We now have almost a civil defence model where the companies work collaboratively. So if there is a terrorist event, immediately they're coming together to remove whatever may have been the original source, and then to systematically share information, hash sharing and so on, to speed up the content moderation. Now, what is new and challenging? So it's meant that in the aftermath of March 15, we have not seen something of that scale, and we've been tested several times on that front. But we're also seeing the challenges of new environments and the content that's coming out as a result of the conflict in Gaza. We are seeing new challenges to terror, the proliferation of terrorist content, and we need to be more agile. And we've previously been dealing with what often is lone actors producing terrorist content and then seeking to distribute it, to how we manage in these situations that we're seeing now, because there has been a significant increase in the amount of terrorist content, but also we're seeing an increase in the amount of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia online. And both, of course, are contributing factors to radicalisation. So we have a role to play there, and we really need to test how our protocols may need to change in order to deal with that. And the other thing that's changed, new technologies. We know AI poses both an opportunity. AI may present tools to enable us to more quickly moderate content, but it also may well contribute to radicalisation. This week, we've welcomed into the Christchurch Call the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic for that very reason, because we need to make sure that we are trying to think ahead. With March 15, we retrofitted solutions onto existing platforms, and retrofitting solutions is hard. It is slow. It is difficult. It often comes up against resistance because, of course, they already exist. Now, with AI, we've got the opportunity to have those conversations and those ethical conversations before some of these tools are being developed, and I think that's incredibly important.
And for you, what should be prioritized in the future plans for the years ahead?
You know, for me, I'd really... so, of course, we see individual tools being developed, and that's really important. I talked really briefly about the possibility we have with AI on content moderation. But for me, Christchurch Call is always about getting to the nub of the issue. How do we prevent radicalisation in the first place, rather than just mopping up the spread of terrorist content in the aftermath? And this is where I'd like to see us continue to work collaboratively. Now, the first thing is to say, I do not believe the online environment is the sole contributor. I believe it exacerbates existing issues that we have in our societies, and here government has a role to play. We have to make sure that we better understand the ecosystem in which individuals are radicalised. And there is already a body of evidence that suggests that, particularly when we're talking about young people, social isolation, disenfranchisement, and often some of those are precursors to then young people seeking an ideological frame that then fits with the experience that they're having. We as governments need to make sure that we are playing our role in addressing those foundation issues. Subsequently, we then need to understand the contribution of the online environment. Now, it's hard for us to address those issues unless we have the data and the research to tell us what is happening. One of the issues we have battled for 4 years is that we always understood that algorithms and curated content was playing a role, but it was very hard for us to understand the user journey. In part because when we tried to ask these questions, companies would share two arguments, and there's something in these arguments. First, privacy. We need to protect individual users' privacy and protection of their data. The second issue was companies were concerned that if we revealed too much transparently, we may lead to individuals being better equipped to weaponize what they were finding out around the way their algorithms worked. And I can understand that. Those should not be barriers for us being able to undertake legitimate and important research. So instead of just continuing to have this battle, we thought, well, why don't we create a tool to try and overcome this? So Microsoft, Twitter, now X, the American government, the New Zealand government, and Open Mind, we came together to fund the development of a tool which has been developed by Open Mind, and it's a privacy-enhancing tool which will enable researchers to directly access otherwise sensitive data whilst protecting the privacy of individual users, and be able to ask a range of different questions. And our hope is that they'll be able to do that over multiple data sets. We started with synthetic data sets. We're now doing it in real time with data across LinkedIn. And we believe that this will meet some of the expectations of the DSA, the Digital Services Act. Now, if that's the case, that will incentivise other companies to allow us to access their information. But our hope is that this will enable us to answer some of these questions around the pathway, the user journey, and pathways to radicalisation. Now, if we can do that, it helps us with two things: holding platforms to account, and then establishing off-ramps. What are the successful interventions when someone is on a pathway to radicalisation? Because my fear is at the moment, the version of off-ramps is not to take someone onto a different path, it's to take someone to a dead end. And you hear this conversation a lot with new, for instance, some of the AI tools. Well, if someone goes and asks, Bing, can you help me make a bomb? Bing will say, no, we don't think that's a good idea, full stop. Not so much a off-ramp, more of a dead end. So let's think about what are the successful ways in which we start bringing people into a journey that addresses those issues around radicalisation. So I see that tool as a really critical product from the Christchurch Call, and I think it'll make a difference.
5 years later, do you believe the call should refine its focus, and on what, for example?
Yeah, a great question. We do get a lot of, I wouldn't say pressure, encouragement, because there aren't many multi-stakeholder environments like ours where you have civil society sitting alongside companies, sitting alongside government, that when new technological challenges arise, like, for instance, generically just the governance of AI, some people say, hey, can the Christchurch Call just kind of, extend themselves a little and deal with all of these new challenges? And I think what's important for us is we have a very clear mandate, and that mandate is terrorism and extreme violent content. However, that's not to say we don't have a role to play in these new challenges. So this is where we've got our meeting tomorrow. We'll be looking to really formalise the fact that we will be working on an AI work stream as it relates to terrorist and violent extremist content. People are equally really concerned about disinformation and information integrity. We're looking to work on that space as it relates to terrorism, violent extremist content. People are worried about the exposure and vulnerability of kids online. We're looking at that as it relates to terrorist, violent extremist content. So whilst we may have a particular mandate, we have an in on some of these challenges, and many of the solutions that we're able to design for TVEC actually have cross-application to other areas. So we believe that's a contribution we can make, and I hope to continue to demonstrate the value of a multi-stakeholder environment as well.
How do you think the country leaders should have to work with the private sector, and especially platforms, to be able to fight against terrorism? Is it important to be close to the platforms? Yeah,
look, I mean, some people, I guess, take a more adversarial view, or believe that by working side by side that somehow you're compromised. In my view, it's just about how do we drive the most effective solutions? How do we get things right? And as a regulator, and I say this with a hat on as a previous regulator, you know what you know. The tool of regulation is often a sledgehammer that, unless you're able to define the problem in front of you, it's very hard to regulate it. Equally, regulation takes a very long time. Very long time. Regardless of your system, even though there's a lot of differences between ours was a Westminster system. If you go for a full process, it's a year minimum. And so here I would say this is where a range of different tools and options is key. And also, one of the things that we learned is by having regulators sit next to a range of companies, rather than designing regulation that's around the lowest common denominator, you get a bit of a tension between companies to actually lift the expectations, because a company is not in the company of one another who they know all understand one another's tech, going to make any claim that won't stand up to scrutiny from their counterparts. I had a couple of experiences in the Christchurch Call where someone might make a claim and someone would turn around and say, well, that's not true. And when you're a regulator, having that tension and that exposure, you know, to where things are not quite as they may seem was extremely helpful. So where some people may have some concerns around working in proximity, I take a different view. In my mind, it actually has led to better outcomes.
At the time of Christchurch, you were a leader, but was it important for you to be also, as you said at the beginning, a user of the social media to understand what was exactly going on?
I have a bit of a theory when it comes to what people call crisis leadership, and I don't know whether or not to feel offended by the fact that I always get asked about crisis leadership. It makes me feel like a bit of a merchant of doom. But it is fair to say that we had a range of really horrific experiences in New Zealand. I was elected at the end of 2017. We then had a major biosecurity incursion at the end of that year. We then in March 2019 had a domestic terror attack. At the end of that year we had a volcanic eruption which took the lives of 21 people. And then in February of 2020, the pandemic arrived. So it was a real time. And in all of that experience, my view is that the markers of crisis leadership include just being willing to be authentic about what you're experiencing as a human. Why should, just because you're a leader, you somehow remove any human emotion attached to a crisis? You know, we have an expectation that leaders, you know, if your national team wins at a national competition, you're allowed to show joy. But if you have a major national tragedy, you're not meant to show grief. I just think that's wrong. And so in times of crisis, there seems to be more acceptance of authenticity. Yeah. And in my mind, that should be a constant. But the second expectation I think that there should be is proximity to the crisis. When you have proximity to the crisis, you have a much better understanding of what those who are being directly affected are going through. I saw firsthand the additional trauma that was being caused by the fact that this content was available online, and therefore I can only imagine or sense that in these more recent examples we're seeing again, it's not just the contribution to radicalisation, but the re-victimisation that comes from it. Imagine losing a loved one, and then at any given time not being able to guarantee that you may not see that in real time online, and how that would feel. And so that proximity during the crisis to that issue was one of certainly a big motivating factor for me personally.
And my last question will be, which decision do you think will make this fifth summit a success?
For the Christchurch Call, for me, actually it will be the decisions that we're making around, we're also having a conversation around the long term, the way that we're going to operate in the long term. We want to ensure that we've got real resilience to the call. This is not a 5 or a 10-year project. This is a project that will exist so long as there is terrorist and violent extremist content online. So for me, the work that we're doing to make sure that we have that long-term resilience, that's actually, whilst that's a bit more of an internal issue, that for me is one of the most important, because this project needs to endure. It really has something to offer the world, and that's, I think, will be one of the really important outcomes of these conversations, is that it is here to stay.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left. Maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions.
And please feel free to, don't limit yourselves. Feel free to ask any question that you would like while I'm here. I'm an oversharer and you should take advantage of that. I can repeat the question. Oh, there is a microphone for you.
how do you see this collaboration with the AI companies going forward in terms of really tackling the issue in Latin America and in the US?
Yeah, so just generally, how do I foresee really the relationship with AI? Coming into the discussion that we're having around AI governance, there's a real skepticism and concern, I think, around consumers. And I think we actually have to pay attention to that. The Pew Institute did a piece of research recently. They've actually done a couple of pieces of being able to track people's perceptions around AI. And people's concerns are deepening, not lessening. The more they hear, in fact, the research found, the more they hear, the more concerned they are, and the majority of people are more concerned than they are excited by the opportunities. Now, I think that probably, and this is just a gut assessment on my part, I think that probably is a consequence of probably previous experience from consumers anytime they've been sold the idea that new technology is going to improve their lives. And the last time we were told that, the great connector, the great democratizer, actually we've seen some of it's been the exact opposite. And so I think people are coming with a degree of skepticism and concern. We should be heeding that and learning the lessons of the past. Before we rush to new development, new enhancements that are going to improve the productivity and presumably improve our lives, be much more aware of the negative sides that it presents to society and the unintended consequence, and design those guardrails before we see those unintended consequences and we then try and retrofit those solutions. So for me, working with AI companies is a chance for us to bring those different understandings, experiences and approaches to the table early on, so that we can really flesh out some of those cons, particularly with that lens of terrorist and violent extremist content. That's our intention and our hope. We're seeing right now some of those who are working in the AI space talking really about where responsibility lies for creating those guardrails. I think it's going to take all of us at the table, and that's certainly what we're hoping to do.
Maybe we can take one last question.
Hi. So being involved in this for a couple of years, we've seen a lot of really good progress, but how do we actually create monitoring and evaluation rubrics to know whether it's an incident or year over year with new technologies that the policies in place and the mechanisms are actually helping to make things better?
Great question. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have, and I would say you made a reference to a specific area of measurement. That idea of greater data and transparency is something that's picked up as a theme across a number of different work streams that we've had. So, off the back of the last Leaders Summit, one of the issues that was raised by civil society was, if we're looking at radicalisation and violent extremism, what are we seeing, for instance, with misogyny online or the experience of LGBTQI+ communities and those pathways to radicalisation extremism? And some of the platforms said, look, it would be helpful to us to better understand that, because that could then inform our content moderation. And so we commissioned some research which is now being produced that itself calls for the importance of greater transparency around the data, because that will then inform some of those decisions around content policy and also help inform just generally some of the work that we need to do in this space. So there is a significant role across the piece, I think, for that increased measurement and transparency. My hope is that the DSA will be further grist to the mill on that question as well. But you're right, over the course of this next meeting, we'll be having a discussion in particular for some of the more recent examples of crisis and where that greater measurement will be important as a KPI of our own role and our own success or need for improvement. Oh, look, there's 40 seconds. Go on, we can extend ourselves. I'll be short.
All right, we can. Then we can take
the woman down the back has been very eager. Are they getting you a microphone? Just, I believe in you. Project.
project. Thank you. It's amazing to be here with you. So I'm here with colleagues. We work in international conflicts around the world. And my question to you was, the conflict prevention agenda. You're saying preventing radicalization before it even happens.
Yeah.
That's the stuff that's not visible, less sexy, hard, painful, long-term.
Yeah.
And so how do you think, you can lend your voice to that kind of work that really is not going to be in the spotlight because it's even before an attack happens or it's before a conflict erupts and takes over the world's attention?
Two things. Firstly, we need to lend our platform to young people to elevate their own voices in this discussion. And in fact, just today we're holding a youth advisory network meeting for the Christchurch Call because we want to do better at bringing the youth voice into the work that we're doing. So that's one thing, is just making sure that we expand the opportunities for others to have voice in this work. And the second thing is actually every leader, any time that they're talking about social cohesion, is talking about this issue. Every time we're dealing with policies that are around removing social isolation and exclusion and disenfranchisement of different communities, we are talking about this issue. So I think for me, it's like, how do we call upon leaders globally to elevate the importance of that role amongst incredibly busy agendas because of the important role it plays in pathways or indeed ending pathways to radicalisation. And I think we also just have to take a long-term view that with every for every conflict and event, we see that, unfortunately, radicalisation breeds and extremism breeds extremism. And I can only speak to our own experience. But if there was one thing New Zealand was determined to do, it was to stop that terrorist from succeeding by not creating an opportunity for him to create another extremist. And I'd like to believe that we succeeded. And we only did that because everyone in New Zealand, I speak broadly here, but everyone in New Zealand utterly rejected his intent. And now we need other leaders to keep emboldening their communities to utterly reject attempts to move people towards extremism and violence.
Thank you very much.